France is going bankrupt? Are you kidding me? Wow, what a surprise, man. Who could have seen that coming, right? Who would have thought that spending 3 decades living beyond your means, running deficit after deficit, would turn out to be a problem, right? Who would have thought that piling up a ridiculously high debt, now at 113% of GDP, would have bad consequences? Are you telling me that's not healthy after all? But yes, France is going bankrupt. It might end up asking for the IMF for help. It's on the news. But you see, France going bankrupt shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, you know? It was obvious that this would end up happening, sooner or later, just like it's obvious that the same will happen to the whole European Union. You see, France and the rest of the EU spent the last decades living on cheap credit, borrowing like crazy, so let's not be surprised that the bill came due, okay? But you see, I'm currently in Europe, in Portugal, and I've been noticing some pretty interesting things here. And the main one is about just how spoiled Europeans have become after so many decades of prosperity, you know? And especially after so many decades under the welfare state. Really, my impression is that people here have gotten so used to prosperity that they live as if the financial rules simply didn't apply to them. Just because this is Europe, you know? And Europe is supposed to be a rich place. However, just because this is Europe doesn't mean you can spend 20 if you only earn 10, you know? Even though this is Europe, the numbers still have to add up. The math still has to work. If you earn 10, you cannot spend 20. That's pretty obvious, right? However, that's exactly what Europe has been doing over the past decades. As I just said, Europe has been living as if the financial rules simply didn't apply to it, running deficits and covering everything with debt. Now, it's true that countries like Sweden, Denmark, and Germany, for example, stayed responsible, right? That's true. So, let's try not to generalize, right? However, many countries such as Spain, Italy, and France simply partied like there was no tomorrow. But let me give you a real example of how people have gotten so used to prosperity that they now think it is a permanent state, okay? You see, I was talking to a real estate agent today, and she was telling me how the housing market in Portugal is simply booming. And of course, one of the reasons behind that is Europe's structurally low interest rates. As she told me, since interest rates are so low, people don't really have a problem taking out loans here, you know? Relax, man. It's okay to take on debt. And then I asked, but what if interest rates go up, you know? What if interest rates go up to 5%, maybe to 8%, maybe even to 10%? You know what she said? She said, oh no, that doesn't happen here in Europe, you know? The European Union controls all of that. Oh, I get it. Well, good luck with that. Brussels is infallible, right? But it's true, the EU does control all of that. She's not wrong, you know. However, do you know how the European Central Bank does that? Well, in the end, it's by creating new money. Or in other words, by printing money. What a genius idea, right? But okay, I get it. So, interest rates here in Europe simply don't go up, okay? So we are all safe, so there's no problem to take on debt to buy a house. Great. But then I asked her, well, if interest rates don't go up, that could eventually trigger high inflation, right? So, what if inflation skyrockets? What if it goes to, let's say, 10% or even higher? Her response, oh no, that doesn't happen. And then I said, well, I'm from Brazil, and I can tell you, that does happen. To which she replied, yeah, but that doesn't happen here. As if to say that inflation and high interest rates are things for developing countries, you know, not for places like Europe, right? As if Europe were somehow above the laws of economics. So that's what I mean when I say that Europeans got spoiled, you know? Because they seem to think that the last few decades of prosperity and stability will simply last forever, no matter what. Because they seem to think that the current state of things is permanent. They forgot that all this past economic success was built on cheap credit. So yeah, France is going through some pretty tough economic times, right? France is facing some serious economic problems because they've just been taking on a ton of debt as if there was no tomorrow. But you see, what we are seeing in France right now is just a preview of what's about to happen across the entire European Union. And I say that because France is far from being the only European country that simply went crazy with debt. For instance, look at Portugal with a debt to GDP at 95%, or look at Spain with this ratio at 103%, or Belgium with 106%, or look at Italy with a debt to GDP at 137%, and finally, the grand champion, Greece, with an impressive 152%. So as you can see, France is far from being the only country that is drowning in debt. So mark my words, what we are seeing in France right now will inevitably happen to many other European countries as well. And you know, there's only one way to stop this problem from blowing up, which is by cutting spending immediately. However, of course that's not going to happen, right? Because you see, talking about cutting spending is basically politically impossible. Pronouncing these words, spending cuts, is like political suicide, because the majority of the population, of the voters, simply don't understand the importance of the government delivering a surplus. No, most people want more government assistance, right? That's what they will vote for. Nobody's going to vote for someone who's talking about spending cuts. No. So, anyone who pronounces these words, spending cuts, is done. And that's pretty much how democracy kills itself, you know? So that's why I believe that a fiscal crisis in Europe is kind of inevitable, you know? Because turning this ship around, stopping this financial bleeding from the state, is basically impossible in my view. People only vote for reforms, for surpluses, for a smaller state. Smaller state, that's a joke. We want spending. But people only vote for these kind of things when the crisis is already very bad, when things are already unbearable. In fact, the French are already reacting, threatening to block everything because of the government's plan to reduce the deficit. And notice that here I said reduce the deficit. I didn't say eliminate the deficit, okay? But because the government announced a plan to reduce the deficit to only 4.5% of GDP, if I'm not mistaken. Well, someone needs to tell the French that keeping the country in deficit mode is certainly not going to fix their fiscal problems, right? You need to eliminate the deficit. Reducing it is not enough. But look at this. That's interesting. France is so addicted to running in the red that it cannot even discuss reducing its deficit a little without people going to the streets. So yeah, France is going bankrupt. And honestly, in my opinion, that's just the beginning, because Europe as a whole is set to sink. And while Europe sinks, Latin America is set to boom, as I explained in this video here. And one country that I think might surprise everyone is this one here, Paraguay. Anyway, that's it for today, and see you next time.